Hi there, folks. Premier Kenney here in my office in Edmonton, and I'm here on Facebook Live for the next hour or so to take your questions, obviously about Alberta's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic crisis that we're facing as well. If you have questions, please put them in the comment section below. I'll try to get to your questions as quick as possible. I guess I'll give you probably would have seen Dr. Hinshaw's daily update today. In terms of total cases and everything else, we have, as of now, a total about 3,700 identified cases of tested positive for the coronavirus in Alberta, 2,200 of which are active, 72 people with this disease in hospital, 18 in intensive care. Sadly, we have so far seen 67 deaths as a result, and 1,360 people who have recovered. Let me just, before you start bringing your questions onto the comments board below, say that I'm proud of how Albertans have responded to this huge challenge. We've seen some other highly developed, sophisticated parts of the world, Italy, Spain, parts of the United States, and others, perhaps Japan now, we reach really the limit of their capacity and exceed the limit of their healthcare system. We've seen some other parts of the world where really, frankly, a nightmare scenario played out in their hospitals where they were choosing who would live and who wouldn't. And that is the situation we've been trying to avoid. We've been trying to avoid a situation where our healthcare system would be overwhelmed. And here's the good news. So far, we have achieved that goal, and we've done it strongly in Alberta, because people have acted so responsibly with discipline. But I know behind that discipline lie a lot of sacrifices, and a lot of people are hurting, not just the families of those who've lost loved ones or those who are sick, and not just the general anxiety about health, but at the same time, we are coping with probably the largest recession globally since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And then on top of that, here in Alberta, as I predicted a month ago, we've now gone into basically, last few days at times, negative prices for Western Canadian oil, for the West Texas Intermediate oil benchmark. When that impacts an industry that represents 20% of our economy, 500,000 jobs across the country, it has a devastating impact on us. And all of this on top of 5 years of economic weakness and adversity. So these are, as I have said, truly challenging times for our province. But I'm so proud of how people have come together with a sense of compassion and solidarity, helping their neighbors, respecting the public health rules to limit the spread. And I just want to start by sharing a sense that hope is there on the horizon. I met today with our relaunch committee and reviewed the first version of our relaunch strategy. We'll be working on this all weekend, and I hope to be releasing a final version of this relaunch strategy early next week. We'll also be releasing an updated version of the models. I know the modeling we've done has taken some criticism, and that's fair. Happy to take any criticism from folks. Please understand that the experts working on this stuff these are people operating in good faith based on enormous amounts of scientific research of how other pandemics have spread across the world. And they are doing their best. I said when we released the models a couple of weeks ago about where COVID could go in Alberta, that they were not a prediction of our fate, but rather a challenge to all of us. And we have risen to that challenge, which is why the number of people hospitalized or in intensive care and the number of fatalities is much lower than our models projected. So I have asked our expert modelers to come up with we had two scenarios. One was probable and another was elevated. I've also asked them to come up with a model that is based on what we're actually seeing in the province, which is, every day, some people are a bit scared by this. We see a significant growth in the number of confirmed cases of infection. And that is in part because, it's a couple of things. One, we have a very high level of testing in Alberta. We've been, the last several days, averaging about 4,000 tests a day. We're pushing the system to get that up to 6,000, 7,000 a day. So as we're testing more than per capita than most parts of the world, it means that inevitably we will reveal more confirmed cases. So yes, we're going to have a higher level of confirmed cases in Alberta than other parts of Canada or the world on a per capita basis because of our high testing. But the number for me that is most important to watch is the number of folks who end up in hospital or ICUs as a result. And that number has stayed well below the models. That's encouraging. And here's the point. It tells me that if we continue to show that discipline, that rigor in controlling this spread, that we'll be in a position to begin the relaunch, to begin gradual reopening of our economy much earlier than we originally hoped for. And to be honest with you, like the models I presented a couple weeks ago from the experts had us hitting the peak in mid to late May, and that for me meant we would gradually reopen in June. But as it stands, if we continue to see relatively low numbers of hospitalizations, ICUs, and frankly much below the projected level of fatalities, I believe that we will be able to begin a responsible, safe, and prudent gradual reopening of the Alberta economy in mid-May, and that's what we're working on. So I'll present more information on that next week, but let me start taking your questions. When will the economy be opening back up? From Derek Walsh. I think I just addressed that. I'll give you more specific information next week, Derek. Let me just say this, though, that Alberta has kept more of our economy open than other jurisdictions across Canada. So we've had a broader definition of what constitute essential services and a narrower band of businesses that we've had to suspend through public health measures during this period. And so I think that's something worth recognizing. In fact, I'll ask my team to get the exact statistics, but my understanding is that fewer than 14% of people who work in the Alberta economy have been affected by the public health orders in terms of suspensions of business, non-essential business activity. So more information on that next week. Derek, Anthony Denunzio says, why have we not started to pursue antibody testing? Well, actually, Anthony, we are pursuing that. A couple of weeks ago, I had some very strong words for the federal government, which had at that point not yet approved any antibody testing. It's also known as antigen testing or virologic testing. So, folks, this is a form of testing which identifies whether people have had the virus in the past and have since recovered from it, rather than just testing a point in time, which is what the conventional tests do. So, as I said in my province-wide televised address 2 weeks ago, it was 15 days ago, I said that aggressive testing, including antibody testing, would be a key element to our relaunch strategy, that I want us to emulate the success of places like Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, which has included very aggressive testing, including antibody testing. Now, Anthony, the scientists tell me that there is not yet a perfectly reliable form of antigen or virologic testing. But I also understand that there are forms of those tests which are very accurate, not perfectly accurate, but 90% plus accurate. So my view is this: if we can get to a place where we're comfortable using those rapid testing kits, which can indicate antibodies or these virologic tests, that can help us to clear people to go back to work with a high degree of confidence, not 100%. But my point is, in a situation like this, where we still do not fully understand the nature of the novel coronavirus, there are still a lot of unknowns out there. But we can't make perfection the model. Like, my view on this is we can't shut down the entire economy, as apparently some people would like us to do, until there is a perfect treatment or a vaccine that can be applied widely. We've got to be prepared to manage risk at acceptable levels. And it seems to me that virologic or antigen testing can be a critical tool in that. Unfortunately, Health Canada has been much slower than the European Drug Agency or the Federal the Food and Drug Administration of the United States in approving antigen testing. So we will continue to push the federal government in that respect. And as I've said, I have directed Alberta officials to prepare for forms of testing which may not yet have been approved by Health Canada if those tests have been approved by regulators with the highest standards in analogous jurisdictions like the European Union, the United States, or Australia. And in fact, we did that. Now, when I came out and said this 2 weeks ago, I was widely criticized by all the usual suspects. But the truth is this, that weeks before Health Canada had approved a rapid test kit produced in Canada, we actually began ordering it. So AHS, Alberta Health Services, has already been following that direction to get ahead of the curve. And now let me just add this about testing. You know, when the World Health Organization was continuing to repeat the line coming out of the PRC about there being no evidence of human-to-human transmission, denying that there was a pandemic, and really trying to minimize concern, when they were continuing to advocate that we maintain wide open borders with no travel restrictions on people coming in from hotspots, while they were doing that, guess what? Well before that, here in Alberta, our officials were responding with common sense. And I've got to tell you, a lot of what we have seen in the global response from the WHO and other bodies during the coronavirus crisis has demonstrated that common sense is not so common. But here in Alberta, thank goodness, we still have a lot of people who are informed by good old-fashioned common sense. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Back in December, when there were the first rumors of a strange new flu or new virus appearing in Hubei province of China, our testing officials at Alberta Precision Laboratories began preparing. They began looking at what the characteristics of this virus might be. They began ordering additional supplies of reagent and testing materials. That's what put Alberta in a position to lead the world in per capita testing when we realized that this was a pandemic in March. Similarly, at the procurement division of Alberta Health Services, our team over there, led by a brilliant man, Jatindra Prasad, as soon as they started to hear rumors about a strange flu in Wuhan and Hubei, China, back in December, they began massively increasing their orders of personal protective equipment and other supplies, which is why we have been the best supplied jurisdiction in Canada and one of the best in the world. It's why we have avoided shortages of critical PPE and other equipment. So I just wanted to let you know that we have consistently been ahead of the curve, and I give full credit to our officials for that. Frankly, for not listening to WHO officials, or for that matter, Public Health Agency of Canada officials. They listened to common sense, they got ahead of the curve, and our intention as a government is to stay ahead of the curve. All right, next question goes to Lisa Goodnison, Lisa. She says, is there talk of reopening schools anytime soon? Well, Lisa, no, there's not. As you know, when we made the very difficult decision to close the schools back in mid-March, the chief medical officer, Dr. Hinshaw, indicated that that would likely be for the balance of the school year. We have not yet made a final decision on that, but stay tuned for a decision in the days to come. I will note that virtually, as far as I know, every other jurisdiction across Canada and the developed world who is coping with COVID-19 have made a decision that they won't go back to general reopening of schools. Some have made, a small number of those jurisdictions have reopened in very limited and discrete ways. In some cases, it's just for grade 12 so that those kids have final grades for university. In some cases, it's in junior grades, but only like a 1 day per week kind of situation. So please stay tuned. It's going to be very difficult because we believe it takes us about 3 weeks. Should we decide that it's safe to reopen the schools generally, it would take about 3 weeks to implement that decision. And right now we're getting towards the end of April. That would be well into May, and the school year, of course, ends in June. So these are the challenges that we're facing on that one, Lisa. All right, Michael DiPolito says, with the relaunch strategy, are you considering putting just younger people back to work? Well, no, Michael. Implicit in your question is the accurate observation that younger people are much less likely to become sick with this virus than much older people. As you've seen, the vast majority of people who contract who develop problematic symptoms related to COVID-19 tend to be over the age of 70, and the mortality rates are quite high for people over the age of 80 or over 90, and much lower for younger people. But they're not zero. Let's be clear. We have seen globally problematic symptoms, hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and deaths amongst people in their 20s and 30s. I saw a really harrowing story about a young, I think a 22-year-old athlete out of Okotoks who was in ICU on a ventilator. So the disease is, it can and does affect younger people. Now, so regardless of the age, we have to take certain public health precautions for everyone. And that's mainly because younger people, even if they don't exhibit symptoms or get really sick, they can spread the disease. And that's why we have to be careful about that. But I will say this, Michael. Clearly, a part of our relaunch strategy must and will be erecting a wall of defense around the most elderly Albertans and those who are most susceptible. So people who have compromised immune systems or have pre-existing respiratory medical conditions, for example, regardless of their age, can be uniquely vulnerable to the novel coronavirus. And so absolutely, Michael, those are folks that we need to build a super strong wall of defense around. That is especially the case for our long-term care facilities, what we used to call nursing homes, as well as other seniors' residences. And you'll see those things reflected in our relaunch strategy. So yes, Michael, the relaunch strategy it'll be smart based on the evidence. And part of that will be a willingness to reopen more quickly in geographic regions that are much less affected by the virus. In general, that in Alberta would mean the rural areas, especially the rural central and north, that are much lower levels of infection. And perhaps potentially Edmonton before Calgary, because of course Calgary has, I think, roughly 70% of the confirmed cases in the province. But it also means that obviously we'll build stronger defenses around the oldest Albertans and those who are immunocompromised. Next question goes to Dixie Gushta, who asks, I heard that Saskatchewan and Manitoba are thinking of lifting their restrictions in the next couple of weeks. How would that affect us, and would we be able to follow suit? So, Dixie, we're following very closely what other provinces are doing, and we may, in fact, coordinate certain aspects of Alberta's relaunch with our neighboring jurisdictions like BC and Saskatchewan, given that we are so closely integrated. For example, we share a city, Lloydminster, with Saskatchewan, and we share a region, the Peace River Country, with British Columbia, and to some extent the East Kootenays and the southwest, Alberta are pretty closely integrated. So there is an argument for that kind of regional cooperation. That's point one. Point two, I don't expect us to be much behind Saskatchewan when it comes to reopening. They have had a much lower level of cases than we've had, so it may be safe for them to reopen a bit earlier than Alberta in some respects. But for all provinces and all parts of the world, the reopening or relaunch is going to happen gradually, but not suddenly. It will happen, as Premier Moe said last night in his TV address, more like a dimmer switch than an on-off switch. And Alberta, together with other provinces and jurisdictions, will be following a phased approach. So, here's my hunch, Dixie. You'll see Saskatchewan probably moving a little bit faster than Alberta because of the much lower level of infections, hospitalizations, and mortalities there. But you'll probably see Alberta moving faster than Quebec and Ontario, even though they are ahead of us on the curve. That is to say, they had their first infections about 3 weeks before Alberta, and they've had a much higher relative level of infections, hospitalizations, and mortalities. So they are dealing with a more serious situation. We will probably be in a position safely to begin reopening measures earlier than them. Teresa Courtney says, if you're looking to reopen starting mid-May, why was Stampede canceled? Let me again say, Teresa, first of all, I was super sad to see the Stampede cancel. For me, it's part of our Alberta identity. And, for so many of us, it really represents summer, the Alberta spirit, the Western heritage, the celebration of agriculture, of community, of so many great things. And what a sad decision. The last time they had to shut down the Stampede was during the First World War. And so I regretted to see that. But the truth is this. I believe we can and will begin reopening measures in a phased way, hopefully starting next month in May, and gradually ramping up, keeping an eye on the numbers of the spread of the virus, the infections, the mortalities, the hospitalizations, to make sure that we keep this well below the maximum capacity of the healthcare system to sustain. Having said that, I do not see any realistic scenario, Teresa, where we would be able to open up events where hundreds of thousands of people are closely congregated together. I mean, think about the Stampede in the grandstands. I think you've got something like 24,000, well, at least 18,000 people, I think, sitting right next to one another in the midway, all with their hands on the same equipment. I mean, there would be no realistic, safe way of putting on an event of the scale of Stampede. I mean, let's think about this, Teresa. They suspended the Olympic Games in Japan that were supposed to happen in August, and they made that decision about a month ago. And so events of that scale in every single part of the world have been suspended. I mean, I hear a lot of talk about the so-called Swedish model. Well, they are not having events with tens of thousands of people in Sweden. Those are banned. There is no country in the world where events of that scale will be happening this summer, I'm afraid to say. All right, Turab Hassan says, what is Bill 10 all about? What are you hiding? Thank you, Turab. I'm glad, I was hoping that question would come up. So we're not hiding anything. In fact, I've got the whole binder on Bill 10 right here. And I think that this bill, based on what I see on Facebook and elsewhere, has taken on a bit of a life of its own. There is, quite honestly, a fair bit of inaccurate information floating around about a lot of issues these days, and I understand that. People are anxious, and they're looking for explanations about what's going on, and there's, you know what? By nature, I'm a small government guy. I helped to start the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, so I'm skeptical about government, big government in general. And a lot of people have alleged that Bill 10 is a huge government power grab. So I have it right here. And now, what has really concerned people is it's alleged that this bill, which we passed through the legislature about 3 weeks ago, supposedly gives the government all sorts of extraordinary powers to enter people's homes, to supposedly impose mandatory vaccinations, to create laws without going to the legislature, etc. So let me walk you through this. Bill 10 was essentially a series of technical amendments to the Public Health Act, which has existed in the legislature as an Alberta law, well, for decades. The original version of the Public Health Act would have come in, I believe, around 1918 during the Spanish flu influenza, which was the closest analog, the closest example we have of what's going on right now with novel coronavirus. And back then, tens of thousands of Albertans died and some vulnerable communities were nearly wiped out. A number of our indigenous communities, for example, were nearly wiped out back in 1918, 1919 with the Spanish flu. And so to control situations like that, the legislature decades ago, a century ago, brought in some truly extraordinary powers. And amongst those are powers for the government, through in this case, the Minister of Health or the Cabinet, upon the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, to issue ministerial orders with pretty extraordinary powers. And included in that are powers to enter any place at any time for any public health reason, powers to conscript people into service, power to require vaccination or inoculation, I think is the word that the bill uses. But those are powers that have all existed for decades in Alberta law. Essentially, Bill 10 was a series of minor technical amendments that we introduced and passed on the advice of Department of Justice lawyers, in part because they were contending that the existing power under the Public Health Act to modify laws was not sufficiently expansive. And here was the concern, that in a worst case scenario where where let's imagine the legislature itself could not meet to pass new laws because of the spread of the pandemic. Let's say our institutions the ability of our institutions to function because of a completely widespread pandemic were to affect even the legislature. The view of our forebears who passed the public health, the original version of the Public Health Act over a century ago was, in such a situation, we need the capacity to govern. And if that means using extraordinary powers, for example, to suspend certain kinds of public activities, large events, for example, certain kinds of non-essential businesses, etc., that we needed to be able to do so through ministerial order rather than by passing a bill through the legislature. So essentially what Bill 10 did was to give some precision to that. Now, having said that, I believe that those powers should only be used in extremis, that we should go to the legislature for any additional powers that we may need. Now, I'll give you just one example. This stuff is not terribly dramatic. Some of it's pretty mundane, pretty boring. We recently learned from the Credit Union Association that there is a legal requirement that they have an annual in-person annual general meeting. If they don't do that, they're offside the law. At the same time, through our public health orders, we are telling them that they cannot meet. So that's a case of where they would seek a ministerial order to amend the Credit Union Act to suspend, at least temporarily, the requirement that they have an in-person annual general meeting. That is the sort of thing that we've been using, the ministerial order powers of the Public Health Act that were modestly broadened through Bill 10 for. I know this stuff is super technical, and I'm sorry if I'm getting lost in the weeds. I'm just trying to explain that these are not new extraordinary powers that we created. Those extraordinary powers have existed for a pandemic, in an influenza pandemic, for decades. In any event, let me tell you that given the public concerns, which I think are reasonable or understandable, I've asked our lawyers to go back to the drawing board, and we're looking at possibly bringing forward amendments to the Public Health Act to narrow, circumscribe, or limit what we brought forward in Bill 10. Perhaps bring in more obvious sunset clauses for these provisions, for example. So stay tuned. We'll give you more information on that in the days to come. Okay, Craig Hubley, pardon me. How are you expecting to ever get back the $10 billion wasted on KXL? There is no way this can even pay, even if WCS bounces back to $20. It costs far more than that to get to the Gulf. Okay, Craig, your question is based on a misunderstanding of energy markets. As I predicted, because of the collapse of demand resulting from the global coronavirus recession and the concurrent surge of supply coming from OPEC, over the past 5 weeks, we have seen a total collapse in oil prices to the point where WCS earlier this week was trading at negative prices. And that is going to inflict some real pain on this economy. There's no doubt about it. However, Craig, what's going to happen is there will be a global recovery. Demand will return. People, when we get past the pandemic, people will begin driving again. They'll begin using airplanes again. Global economic growth will return. And with that recovery will come an increase in consumption of oil. With the increase in consumption will come an increase in prices. At the same time, thank goodness we've seen some sanity return to OPEC Plus, and they have committed to a reduction of global supply from those countries of 10 million barrels per day. And we've also seen the market function in places like North America with probably millions of barrels a day of production being shut in. So between the future increase in demand and the reduction in supply, the market will work. And over time, prices will get back to some kind of a normal. And we would expect to see, once we draw down on the global inventories that are currently driving prices down, once the demand returns, the economy begins growing again, prices will recover, likely to WTI north of $50 a barrel. And here's the point. When we get to that world, if we want to restart the largest industry in Alberta, the oil and gas industry that is responsible for 500,000 jobs directly and indirectly, an industry that has paid about $380 billion in taxes and revenues to governments over the past 18 years, the largest subsector of the Canadian, not just the Alberta economy, the largest export industry. This is not an industry, those 500,000, Craig, I don't know where you come from, but I am not prepared to say there's no future for that, the largest industry in our province and our country. And to ensure a future, once prices recover, we must have the infrastructure that will get our energy to markets. We will be back in the same position we were in 6 months ago or 2 years ago, which is a surplus of capacity of energy in Alberta over our ability to ship it. We won't have if we don't get something like KXL done, Keystone XL done, then we will be back to the painful situation we were in prior to the pandemic, which is having insufficient export capacity for Alberta energy. And I appreciate the federal government having purchased the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the ongoing efforts to build it. Construction continues. But I am not prepared to wager the future of the largest Alberta and Canadian industry on that one project alone. So Keystone XL is our hedge against it. Now, secondly, Craig, we haven't spent $10 billion. I don't know where you're getting that information from, that it's completely false. We have invested $1.5 billion, not $10 billion. You're off by only a factor of about nearly 100%. We have, nearly 1,000%. You're off by about tenfold. We have invested $1.5 billion, taking a preferred equity position in the Keystone XL pipeline to get construction started. And here's the good news. It is moving forward. In fact, they installed pipe across the Saskatchewan-Montana border last week. And I know that all of the frantic, ideological voices of the Green left who have wanted to shut down all these pipelines and landlock Alberta energy are crying crocodile tears now. They are angry that we have proceeded. But I'll tell you what, Craig, that's one of the reasons we did it, was to send a message to folks who want to shut down Alberta's energy industry that they will not succeed, that we Albertans will prevail, that we will overcome the foreign-funded campaign to landlock our energy. Come hell or high water, we are prepared to use the full balance sheet of the government of Alberta to ensure our future prosperity. And this was exactly the right thing to do. Now, in addition to the $1.5 billion equity investment, there is a loan guarantee that follows next year and in the range of $6 billion, but no more cash from the government of Alberta. It is a loan guarantee to allow TransCanada Energy it's now called TC Energy, to get access to commercial rates of credit to finance the balance of construction as we move towards completion of Keystone XL by the summer of 2023, which, when it is fully commissioned, will allow us to ship an additional 830,000 barrels per day of Alberta oil. And we estimate that this will increase Alberta government revenues by at least $30 billion. And here's another thing, Craig. That project, which we're investing in, I make no apologies for it, is creating good paying jobs in Alberta right now when we need them. This will create thousands of high paying construction and oil field jobs, building that pipeline from Hardisty to Montana as we speak, while also investing in the long-term strategic interests of the future of Alberta energy and therefore our largest industry. All right, Jess J says, I think people understand the impact of COVID, but is the plan to start saving, but what is the plan to start saving our oil and gas industry? Thanks, Jess. Well, I think I just gave part of that answer. Keystone XL was a central part of it. We have also, as a government, rolled out nearly $15 billion of economic support for households and employers, job creators. So when it comes to the oil and gas industry, for example, well, for industry and employers generally in Alberta, we've deferred business taxes, we've deferred non-linear property taxes, WCB premiums, we've swallowed the cost of half of those for small and medium-sized businesses. We have provided extended leases for oil development for a year. That is to say, if a company has a lease from the government of Alberta, we're extending that by a year so they don't lose it during this year when they won't be producing or exploring. We have swallowed Alberta Energy Regulator fees for the year, which is a big boost to the industry in the range of $113 million, and a whole lot more. We put hundreds of millions of dollars into the Orphan Well Association to help accelerate well reclamation. We have fought very hard and successfully to get the federal government to come in behind us on that with their $1.7 billion in cash for accelerated oil field reclamation and oil well reclamation completion and remediation. And next week we'll be releasing the details of our plan in that regard. Actually, what am I saying? That's tomorrow. Everything's a blur these days. Tomorrow, Minister Savage and I will be releasing the plan to create, we estimate, upwards of 6,000 jobs in the oil field service sector through the surge in well remediation and completion. And I do appreciate that in addition to all of that, the Government of Canada announced credit backstop for small and mid-sized oil and gas companies, which I estimate may have represent about $6 billion in credit backstop for those companies to ensure that they can continue to get access to commercial rates of credit so they can finance their way through the crisis. And then finally, we are pressing the federal government as hard as we can to come forward with an even larger package in the range of $15 to $30 billion of credit backstop. And should they not do so, well, first of all, it would be grossly irresponsible for them to abandon this industry. As I've pointed out, the largest subsector of Canada's economy, the largest export industry, 500,000 Canadian jobs are dependent upon it, tens of billions of dollars of revenue for governments every year dependent on it. So, and as I've pointed out, when the world was in the global financial crisis 12 years ago, it was the Alberta oil and gas sector that helped Canada to survive that economic storm more strongly than virtually any other developed place in the world. And when the national government backstopped the Central Canadian auto manufacturing sector in 2008, well, we were there for Central Canada. And finally, there is not an industry in Canada that is not in some way affected by Canada's oil and gas industry. So the largest industry in Ontario, arguably these days, has become financial services, the banks. And they are massively dependent on the future of the Canadian energy sector. So this is the case that we are making to the federal government about why we need to ensure the liquidity, the cash capacity of the oil and gas sector. If the federal government does not come through sufficiently, then we are looking at what we may need to do to ensure a future for our largest job-creating industry. All right, Daryl, I'm sorry, folks, some of these answers are long, but these are super complex questions in terms of these issues that we're grappling with. All right, Daryl Tick says, is the Heritage Trust Fund going to be utilized in this pandemic? Well, Daryl, the answer is that we are prepared and we are using the balance sheet of Alberta. And the Heritage Fund represents some of the assets, about $18, $19 billion of the assets in that balance sheet, on that balance sheet. And we are keeping our options open. I mean, when Peter Lougheed started the Heritage Fund back in 1976, the idea was it was there as a rainy day fund. Well, it's never rained harder, at least not since the Great Depression, in terms of Alberta's economy. So, in principle, we are prepared to use all of the tools at our disposal to protect Albertans from the impact of the terrible economic storm that we are just beginning to experience. And I say just beginning, knowing full well that so many people have already been through 5 very tough years. But as I said in my televised address to Albertans 15 days ago, I'm not sugarcoating this. Between the 5 years of fragility we've been through, the coronavirus global recession, which is probably something like a 30% contraction of the Canadian and Alberta economies, and then on top of that, the negative prices for oil, Daryl, there's just no way of sugarcoating this. This is as I've said, a triple threat that is going to be very, very, very difficult for Albertans. And that is why we are prepared to do whatever is necessary to get people through this. Here's the truth. We cannot save every business that is going to be distressed right now. What makes me emotional and gives me just enormous amount of anxiety is as we look at our economic recovery plan, realizing that there is not enough fiscal power in the government of Alberta to insulate everybody from the economic adversity that we will be going through. We have to be smart about this, about how we respond. We've appointed an Economic Recovery Council with which I meet every week that is made up of some of the smartest Albertans and most successful Alberta entrepreneurs, including representation from the labor movement. And they are giving me the very best external advice on how to make the right choices. As I say, we've already committed over $15 billion of action. The truth is that this year we are likely to hit a deficit in the range of $20 billion, up from the already ridiculously high $6 billion. And so I guess my point is that, Daryl, in principle, yes, we're prepared to leverage the provincial balance sheet to get through the unprecedented time of adversity that we're headed into over the next 18 to 24 months. But I'm concerned that we will not have adequate fiscal power to insulate everybody from what's coming at us. And so we as Albertans need to think long and hard about the choices that are facing us. Jason Pill says, when can we reopen surgical suites again? That's a good question, Jason. And that is something we're looking at doing in the first phase of our relaunch strategy. is to begin gradually rescheduling elective surgeries, because as you know, Jason, the longer we delay those, the more some people's health situations will be complicated, and the harder it will be for them, the more pain people live through often, and the more complex it will be to remediate their health condition. So I believe we need to start reopening non-elective surgeries and as soon as we can, and I hope to have some good news about that in the days to come. Travis Alexander says, why did you close down Campion when it's the easiest way to social distance rather than have everyone stuck in the city? It's a good question, Travis. Here's the deal. About 3 weeks ago, I believe, we saw a unprecedented surge of people into our parks and backcountry, including for camping. And we saw, like 3 weeks ago in March, a volume of visits to the parks and camping that exceeded what we normally get on the May long weekend, which is usually the peak of park utilization for the year. And we just weren't set up to cope with the volume. Please remember that provincial public servants are facing the same health challenges as the rest of the population, which means a lot of our workers, including our park wardens, our fish and game officers, our Alberta Environment and Parks personnel, a lot of them are off work because of self-isolation. Maybe they've had symptoms, or they were traveling, or they've had close contact, so our workforce has been reduced. So we had unprecedented traffic in our parks, including our campgrounds, at a time of the year when we were not fully staffed. Then we had less than our normal staff complement because of the coronavirus. And then on top of that, we had people stealing sanitation products out of our campground washrooms and our rest stops. And we had people congregating in the parks irresponsibly. We had one lake which was set for breakup, where there were normally at this time of year there would only be dozens, but there were hundreds of people in there in a very unsafe environment. So I could go on, but basically the advice from our parks officials was that we could not cope safely with the volume of people who were understandably desperately trying to get out of being locked up in their apartments and homes in the cities. So I regret that we had to suspend camping and provincial park sites and everything else. But we're now that we've been able to sort of catch our breath and catch up and get staffed up, we're now taking a second look at that, and I hope that we can reopen all or most of our provincial parks, including camping sites, in the first phase of the relaunch, or perhaps even earlier. But whether we are able to do so sustainably will depend on how people conduct themselves. If what happens is we end up with big crowds of people out there ignoring the social distancing, public health measures, and just being irresponsible, if people vandalize our restrooms and steal stuff out of them, if it becomes uncontrollable, then we may have to suspend again. So I do hope to get to reopening of the campgrounds and the provincial parks soon. But folks, if you're going to go out there and enjoy our magnificent parks, campgrounds, or the backcountry, please do it safely, and I trust people to do that, but we just got to make sure that we can keep the situation under some reasonable control. Please give me 1 second. Thank you. So Ryan Matthews says, I missed. Tobias Terrell says, when will you open golf courses? If I can go to a park and walk with social distancing, I should be allowed to do it with a club in my hand. Fair point, Tobias, and I totally hear you. I think the golfers have made a pretty strong case. Golfing is with just some minor adjustments can be done in a way that respects the public health measures and social distancing and all of that. To be honest with you, I think it's been hard for the chief medical officer to validate golfing as a essential service. And so we've been looking at this in the context of gradually reopening parks and camping and things like that. So Tobias, please stay tuned. I do note with interest that Saskatchewan and BC have reopened golfing. And like, I get the point people have been making that anything that gets people physically active is good for their health, and that is therefore good for public health. I get the argument, and so we're working through these issues with the Chief Medical Officer for Health, on whose advice I obviously have to depend for these issues. All right, Ryan Matthews says, just a second, Ryan. Can't quite see that. Okay, Jeff Clemens says, if isn't the pipeline investment blocked by the state, what's the plan for that? No, it's not, Jeff. I think you might be referring to a recent decision by a federal court in the state of Montana that addressed two very specific and relatively small aspects of the Keystone XL pipeline, namely a couple of river crossings that are in the construction plan for Keystone XL. And essentially, the judge said that he was not persuaded that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had done sufficient due diligence on the environmental impact or the engineering impact of the Keystone XL pipeline on two river crossings in informing President Trump's presidential permit for the border crossing. But the court decision applied narrowly to those two river crossings. It has not negatively affected the general construction. So construction continues, and I will be giving the public an update on the Keystone XL construction progress tomorrow with Minister Sonia Savage. So I can see Ryan now wondering about your plan for rural Alberta after all physicians leave because of Minister Chandra's actions. Ryan, all of our physicians are not leaving. Let me just remind you that we have the best compensated physicians in Canada. We have the most expensive healthcare system in Canada. On a per capita basis, we spend about 20% more than the average on healthcare across the country, even though we have the youngest population. We should therefore have the least expensive healthcare system. We actually have the most expensive healthcare system, and generally, we have not had the results to justify that. We have had higher than average infant mortality, lower than average life expectancy, and in many areas, longer than average surgical wait times. So that is why, and one of the reasons for that, the single largest area of health expenditure in Alberta has been physician compensation. That is, in fact, the single largest expenditure of the government of Alberta. 10% of our $55 billion provincial budget goes to physician compensation, and according to both the Ernst & Young performance review of Alberta Health Services and the Dr. Janice McKinnon's panel on Alberta's fiscal health, our physicians are on average receive about $100,000 more in gross compensation than their counterparts in Ontario, even though we have a lower cost of living than Ontario. So, and finally, let me say that physician compensation in Alberta has grown by nearly 300% over the past 18 years. So on average, that means that physician compensation has been doubling every 6 years. There is no other occupation for which that is the case. It's certainly not the case for the taxpayers who pay for the physician compensation. Having said all of that, we value our fantastic physicians. I believe they should not just be fairly compensated, but generously compensated. In fact, I don't even have a problem in principle with our physicians making somewhat more than their counterparts across the rest of the country. Not 25% more than some provinces, but the main thing is we've been trying to get to a situation where we could stop the doubling of physician compensation every 6 years, to have some tools better to manage that, because otherwise it would become unaffordable. And let me just say, Ryan, now that we're headed from a $6 to a $20 billion deficit, we absolutely must continue to find ways to manage our expenses at least as intelligently as other provinces do. And we cannot exclude the single largest payroll expenditure of the province, which is physician compensation. Now, having said that, I recognize that rural physicians have unique situations, unique circumstances. They are serving a smaller population, and therefore often their capacity to bill is lower, and often they have to carry more overhead, and very often primary care physicians in rural communities are also serving hospitals, and so there are unique challenges and unique challenges for rural communities in attracting and retaining physicians. So Minister Shandro and many of our government rural MLAs have been in ongoing conversations with rural physicians about how to address those unique circumstances. And Minister Shandro will have an update on that, I believe, tomorrow as well. All right, Kathy Seda Drake says, have we ensured that there is zero Middle East oil and gas being sold in Alberta? Yes, Kathy, I can happily assure you there is zero Middle East oil sold here. Unfortunately, Canada still imports, I think, about 10 million barrels a year from Saudi Arabia and more, a lot. Central and Eastern Canada import a lot from the United States. Not that I'm not trying to draw an equivalence between U.S. and OPEC oil, but we still, ridiculously, as a country with the third largest oil reserves on earth, the fourth largest oil producer, we are still importing a lot of foreign oil, some of it from OPEC, some of it from the British North Sea, and a lot from the United States through Central and Eastern Canada. None of it comes to Alberta. But Kathy, I have been involved in conversations with top U.S. leaders about the concept of a coordinated North American tariff on foreign oil imports. And this effort this discussion about a import tariff on foreign oil was instigated by the outrageous decision of Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations to surge their production and supply of oil in the face of a massive reduction in demand. And I believe that what they were doing was predatory dumping, trying to drive U.S. shale and Canadian oil sands oil out of the global markets. And they ended up shooting themselves in the foot because I guess they didn't see the degree of demand destruction that was happening because of the coronavirus recession, and so they drove themselves into the poorhouse, which is why they've now come back with a 10 million barrel a day reduction. Not good enough. But the bottom line is, Kathy, we continue our discussions. I've been speaking to the U.S. Secretary of Energy. I've spoken to over 10 members of the United States Senate, many members of the U.S. Congress, several governors. Minister Sonia Savage has been talking to the Texas Railroad Commission, which is kind of, oddly enough, their version of the Alberta Energy Regulator. And we have been in discussions about what I call a continental energy policy to stop or inhibit OPEC imports into North America. And I want to thank the premiers across Canada for backing me up on that, including the premiers of Newfoundland and New Brunswick. All right, 1 second, please. Tina Stashishin says, how will the funds for the orphan well cleanup be distributed? What's the process? Tina, we are going to give you a detailed answer to that question tomorrow at a news conference with Minister Savage, which I believe is at 11 a.m., so stay tuned for that. Melissa Alexandruk says, any idea what the future looks like for restaurants and pubs? Thank you, Melissa. I am so I'm just so sorry for the people in our restaurant and hospitality sectors and tourism that have been probably more affected than any segment of the economy by this whole situation. Let me just first of all encourage Albertans to patronize our restaurants in any way you can. Many of them are doing a takeout service, and we've allowed them to do liquor off sales. So here's a shout out. I'm glad we have liquor stores, but if you're going to buy some beer or wine or whatever, think about buying that from your local restaurant or pub that has off sales, just to keep them in business, because the liquor stores are continue to be open. Also, a lot of restaurants are now offering pantry service. So if you don't want to go into a big grocery store and you want specialty products, a lot of restaurants will sell that to you. That's a way to support them. Buy gift certificates so they can get cash now on future sales. And I would say that we do hope that in the second phase of our relaunch, we can begin reopening restaurants for in-house service, in-store service, sit-down service is what the word I'm looking for, as long as they have social distancing protocols. But I think it's going to be difficult for us. I do not think that Dr. Hinshaw will recommend allowing bars, for example, nightclubs and bars, to reopen fully until the last phase of the relaunch, just because obviously that's where you're going to get a lot of people in very close quarters. But we are providing as much support as we can. We have deferred, obviously property taxes, WCB premiums, and the federal government is providing the wage subsidy, as well as they are now rolling out a cost share program for rent support for commercial tenants, and I'll be making a statement about that. I think it's tomorrow as well, and so there is a great deal of support out there. But I know it's going to be very tough times, because restaurants are a tough business at the best of times, and it's even tougher now. Okay, we've been at this for 1 hour, folks, and I have a conference call I've got to get to. I'm actually already late for, so let me just take 3 more questions. Zoe Rackman says, what is the provincial government doing for small business? Well, thank you, Zoe. First of all, we have deferred workers' compensation board premiums for that's a $750 million benefit to businesses. We are paying for all of the WCB premiums this year for small businesses. That's a $350 million benefit. We are freezing education property taxes for businesses. That's an $87 million benefit. A 6-month deferral on education property taxes, that's a $460 million benefit. We've delayed Alberta energy regulator premiums, which also includes a benefit to some small oil and gas companies. That's a $113 million benefit. We haven't just delayed that, we're paying the costs. We've deferred to August 31st corporate income tax payments. That's a $1.5 billion deferral. We have extended the filing deadline for annual returns with Alberta Corporate Registry for up to 2 months. That's a $6.3 million deferral. We've deferred the tourism levy by $5 million. We've deferred, doubled the capital maintenance and renewal funding budget for the government that will put a lot of small contracting companies back to work. That was a $1 billion surge. And those are some of the things we've done. And then on top of the federal government measures, which include the $107 billion amount for the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy and the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, $85 billion in tax deferrals, $65 billion in credit support to businesses delivered through the Business Credit Availability Agency. I should point out that we have also delivered about, I think, $6 billion in liquidity measures for households and businesses through Alberta Treasury branches. And the federal package also involves expanding the Canada Emergency Business Account to businesses that, basically to small and medium-sized businesses in particular, and I could go on. But between us and the federal government, we're talking about approaching $200 billion in action to support employers as they survive through this. All right, Rodney O'Donnell says, why are these meat processing plants allowed to stay open? Well, Rodney, first of all, the meat processing plants constitute an essential element of food security for our society. And for example, the 2 largest beef packing plants in Alberta represent 80% of the beef that is produced and consumed in Western Canada. That represents millions of meals. And if you were to take those off completely, it would significantly compromise food security. That applies to other food processing plants, including for poultry, et cetera. And I know that some people are just telling us to shut all of that down. Well, that would have a devastating impact on food security. And we believe that it is possible, under the rigorous oversight of our public health officials and regulatory agencies, safely to operate food processing plants. I can tell you that the Canada Food Inspection Agency, Alberta Agriculture, Alberta Occupational Health and Safety, Alberta Health Services, public health officers are all present in and observing the safety measures the enhanced safety measures that have been taken at food processing plants, including meatpacking plants. Cargill's beef processing plant at High Level has suspended its operation because of a lack of available workers. And it's distressing to see the outbreak that occurred attached to that plant. I want to stress, as Dr. Dina Hinshaw, our Chief Medical Officer of Health, has said repeatedly, that the outbreak associated with that group was not all primarily transmitted at the plant, but much of it through carpooling and by people bringing in the infection in from other workplaces. In fact, we will be releasing data, I believe, next week that shows the pattern of some of the transmission that occurred. In one case, I believe, from a prayer meeting that happened several weeks ago to a long-term care worker, to a spouse of a long-term care worker, to somebody that worked at that plant, to other people that worked at that plant through carpooling, to people that they work with in other environments. So it is not correct, as Dr. Hinshaw has pointed out, to identify the operation of a food processing plant as being uniquely vulnerable to transmission when there are many more complex public health factors at play here. And again, we're not going to unnecessarily shut down food security for not only Alberta, but for most of Western Canada. We will continue to follow the advice of our public health experts, including the Chief Medical Officer, when it comes to these things. And they are they're completely engaged in ensuring the safe operation of plants. For example, at the JBS beef plant in Brooks, they have a full testing of the entire workforce going on. They are setting up a local testing facility in Brooks, and enhanced safety measures were instituted weeks ago, in fact. So everything everything possible is being done to permit the continued safe operation of the food processing industry in Alberta. But if you want to shut down anything that operates like a processing facility, like a factory, then that's going to be vegetable processing facilities, as well as greenhouses, as well as, frankly, grocery stores. So we have to allow the supply chains to continue to operate to permit for food security as a vital essential service. All right, 3 more questions. Sorry, folks, I'm getting a bit dehydrated, I guess. Elaine Bruce says, how about better testing, more testing, and also tracking? Thank you, Elaine. Better and more testing and tracking are essential elements of our relaunch strategy, as I underscored in my televised address 2 weeks ago. And I'm pleased to tell you that Alberta continues to lead Canada and most of the world in our per capita incidence of COVID-19 testing. And we have a plan to continue increasing that. We hope to, within the next couple of weeks, increase that from about 4,000 daily tests upwards to 7,000. And ultimately our stretch goal is to hit 20,000 tests a day. We are also aggressively pursuing the possibility of widespread availability of serologic or antigen testing, which I've discussed earlier in tonight's session. And the testing, pardon me, I know I'm not supposed to touch my face, but I think we're all more conscious of that these days. The testing is a critical part of tracing and tracking, and this is really a key element of the success of jurisdictions like Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore, because widespread testing allows them to identify cases immediately, begin tracing the close contacts of those cases. And that's one of the reasons we've had, I think, much greater success in Alberta than other jurisdictions. So that will be a key part. And part of the testing, the tracing and tracking, will involve the intelligent and limited use of technology like smartphone apps on a volunteer basis like they've done in Singapore. Stay tuned for more information on that. All right. Leanne Forsyth says, wasn't the Fair Deal panel report due a couple of weeks ago? When is the announcement? Thanks, Leanna. Yes, I believe that the work is complete. We have not received it. I think the Fair Deal panel, which has done great work, and thank you to everybody who contributed to that, has held back on formally presenting the government with the report because we are obviously working 24/7 on the pandemic. But I do look forward to receiving the report in the near future, having a chance to digest that and release it to the public. And finally, Kelly Cabanas' weddings have not been clarified. What can and cannot happen? Well, Kelly, I think it's fairly clear. Weddings can proceed as long as there's less than 15 people attending and as long as they observe the public health orders with respect to social distancing and hygiene. All right, folks, I've been at this for an hour and 15 minutes. I'm late for a conference call. Thank you for the good questions. I hope to keep doing these. We might do another one back again with Dr. Hinshaw. Although I must confess, she's been working so hard that we're trying to make sure she has more time to manage the public health office that she oversees, because we've been having Dr. Hinshaw not only do these news conferences every day, but also often every night she's doing conference calls with whether it's mayors or different communities, different interest groups or industries. Plus, she's done some of these Facebook Live sessions with me, and I want her to be able to focus her time on actually the enormous workload that she and her team are faced with right now. Just want to thank her for her tremendous work, and thank all of you as Albertans for coming together. Yesterday, I made a renewed call for volunteers to help in safe ways. And the ways that Albertans have been responding to this crisis are just phenomenal. So I know this is a super challenging time for everybody. As I always say, please remember that you're not alone, even if you're isolated by yourself. There's a whole community of people who care for one another. And this is a time when we're really seeing what Albertans are made of. So thank you for the compassion and the solidarity that you're demonstrating. Thank you for caring so much about how we're going to get through this together. We're going to have some interesting announcements tomorrow related to the economy and healthcare. And then hopefully next week we'll be releasing the outlines of our relaunch strategy. So thank you once again to our fellow Albertans for all of your good questions. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.